A B-17 crewman opened a small cardboard box over Germany and changed the air war in seconds. No guns. No explosives. Just junk metal, drifting into the night. What happened next blinded German radar, shattered their defenses, and sparked a secret race of invention the world never saw coming. The night sky over northern Germany boiled with searchlights, rising in jagged white spears that clawed at the darkness. Engines hammered the cold air as an American B-17 formation pushed toward its target, each bomber holding its line against wind, flak, and the quiet fear creeping through every fuselage. In the lead aircraft, a young crewman looked down at a small cardboard box resting on his lap. Inside was something that didn't look like a weapon at all. Just thin strips of aluminum foil. Nothing about it felt heroic. Nothing about it felt like the kind of thing that could change a war. But he had been told, quietly and without ceremony, that what he carried could blind Germany. It could give the Allies a new kind of invisibility. And if it worked tonight, it would unravel months of German radar mastery that had cost hundreds of American lives. He was also told not to use it. Not yet. Higher command feared the enemy would copy it if they realized what it was. But the crewman had his own view of the war, shaped by watching too many B-17s fall burning through the clouds. Tonight, with the searchlights already moving toward his formation, he felt a decision tightening around his chest like a harness strap. Obey orders or save the men around him. The cardboard box trembled with the vibration of the engines. A promise of something world-changing hid inside it. To understand why that small box mattered, you have to see the war from above. By 1943, radar had become the quiet tyrant of the European air war. Germany's scientists had built a web of early warning systems stretching from the French coastline to the Ruhr. The chain carried a bomber's fate from antenna to antenna. Once an American formation appeared on the screens, Luftwaffe controllers could vector fighters directly into the bomber stream. Flak guns adjusted their aim long before the bombers came into sight. The Germans didn't need to see the Americans to attack them. They only needed angles, timing, and mathematics. To the bomber crews, it felt like flying through a trap they could never truly escape. The B-17 was tough, but the Luftwaffe picked at its armor with surgical precision. Many crews never saw the fighters that killed them. This was the challenge that British and American scientists wrestled with in dark, cluttered rooms full of oscilloscopes and humming components. They needed something that would confuse the German radar picture. Something simple enough to mass-produce and clever enough to throw the enemy's mathematics into chaos. The breakthrough came from a surprisingly humble idea. Radar reflected off metal. If you could put enough small bits of metal into the sky, radar wouldn't know what was bomber and what was drifting scrap. It became known as chaff to the Americans and window to the British. A bundle of thin aluminum foil strips, cut to the exact length that matched the wavelength of German radar. When released, these strips fluttered downward like metallic snow, filling the sky with false echoes. To the radar operators, it would look like entire bomber formations splitting and multiplying across the screen. No way to tell real from fake. Simple, elegant, and deadly. But there was a problem. The fear wasn't whether it would work. Everyone agreed the concept was sound. The fear was that if the Allies used it too early, Germany would copy it and deploy it against the RAF and US bombers in return. Both sides had radar. Both sides depended on it. So the invention sat in limbo, waiting for the right moment. Waiting for a commander brave enough to unleash it. Waiting for a crewman willing to break the rules to save lives. On that night over Germany, the young airman with the box felt time slipping away. The first bursts of flak bloomed below. Black clouds of smoke tore open the sky. The formation tightened instinctively, each pilot trusting the other not to drift or falter. Inside the radio compartment, the airman stared at the thin metal strips again. His breathing felt too loud in the cramped space. The intercom crackled with clipped voices. Ahead, he could see the faint glow of fires on the ground, cities already burning from earlier waves. He remembered the briefing officer's voice, "Do not deploy the chaff unless ordered." And then the quieter voice from another officer he trusted more, "If it gets bad out there, you'll know what to do." Another explosion shook the B-17. Flak tore past the right wing, showering sparks. A waist gunner shouted something sharp and frightened. The pilot fought the controls. The airman made his decision. He pushed open the small hatch near his station. Wind screamed into the compartment. He held the box tightly, tore it open, and threw the first handful of aluminum strips into the roaring darkness. For a moment nothing happened. The foil caught the slipstream and spread outward like a silver cloud. It spun and twisted down the bomber's wake, trailing hundreds, then thousands of glints as the next handful scattered into the sky. Then the searchlights stopped. They froze in place, confused as if unsure where to look. The beams wandered, sweeping through empty sky. Flak fire grew erratic. Fighters circling to intercept hesitated, losing their sense of direction. The airman felt it before anyone said a word. The German radar picture had just fractured. What he didn't know was that miles below, inside a Luftwaffe command bunker, officers stared at their radar screens in disbelief. Their carefully plotted tracks suddenly exploded into a storm of false signals. Dozens of phantom bomber formations appeared across the scopes. Controllers shouted contradictory instructions. Fighter groups launched in the wrong direction. Flak batteries wasted precious ammunition firing blind. The German early warning network had been the pride of their air defense system. Tonight it looked like it was melting. The Americans didn't know the full extent of the damage yet. They only knew that for the first time in months, they had slipped through the radar net almost untouched. Inside the lead B-17, the pilot called back on the intercom, his voice carrying something rare for a combat mission. Relief. Flak's losing us. Whatever you did back there, keep doing it. The airmen didn't need to be told twice. Handful after handful of metallic strips streamed from the bomber. The darkness behind them twinkled like a broken constellation. Other aircraft in the formation spotted the cloud and realized what was happening. Soon more hatches opened. More boxes emptied into the night. Above Germany, a curtain of silver fell across the sky. What began as a desperate act by a single crewman would soon ripple outward into Allied strategy. Within weeks, chaff became standard equipment. Entire bomber groups deployed it in waves, creating corridors of confusion where radar-guided defenses collapsed. American planners finally had a countermeasure that didn't rely on luck or sacrifice. It relied on ingenuity. And yet, the story of who first dared to use it remains one of the war's quieter legends. An unnamed airman defying orders because he believed survival mattered more. A decision made in seconds that would cripple German radar for months. But this moment was only the beginning. Because the real secret wasn't just that chaff worked. It was how its early use triggered a hidden race inside Germany's radar program. One that would spiral into miscalculations, political interference, and overconfidence. A race the Allies were already preparing to exploit. The horizon over the North Sea glowed faintly as another American bomber stream pushed toward Germany. Engines drummed in unison, steady and practiced, but everyone on board sensed something different in the air. Word had spread through whispers and mess hall rumors that a new trick had been used on a recent mission. No one had the full story yet, but they had heard pieces. Searchlights losing lock. Fighters wandering. Flak guns firing blind. Crews landing with fewer bullet holes than usual. Something had shifted, and bombermen were quick to notice when death suddenly seemed a step farther away. Inside the operations room back in England, senior officers studied reconnaissance photos and radar analysis with growing interest. Tracks from that night's raid were oddly inconsistent. German defensive fire had wavered. Fighter interception curves looked broken, almost as if the enemy had lost its sense of direction. The analysts didn't need long to connect the dots. Someone had used the foil. Someone had ignored the restrictions. And instead of reprimands, the room filled with a silent acknowledgement. The risk had been worth it. Within days, approval arrived. Chaff, officially cleared for deployment. The command structure moved fast once they realized what had happened. Factories began packaging millions of foil bundles. Training officers briefed crews on exactly when and how to drop them. What had begun as a quiet experiment in a cramped radio compartment was now becoming a central part of American air strategy. But while the crews felt a cautious sense of hope, deep inside Germany the reaction was very different. Radar operators who once boasted about their perfectly calibrated systems now stared at chaotic screens, trying to understand how their mastery had been shattered by something they couldn't see. In an underground bunker near Bremen, a young technician wiped sweat from his forehead as a commander demanded answers. The radar echoes pulsing on the screen made no sense at all. Entire formations seemed to swell, split, and shift. Every signal held the same strength. The same density. No pattern. No direction. The operators had trained for years to identify altitude changes, angles, and speeds. Now they were fighting ghosts. The confusion traveled upward through the command chain until it reached the Luftwaffe's radar development offices. Engineers with glasses perched low on their noses sifted through reports while officers paced behind them, urging immediate solutions. The German response began with denial. Their radar system had been considered one of the most advanced in the world. The Würzburg and Freya networks had guided interceptors with deadly precision. They couldn't accept, not at first, that something so crude as strips of metal could blind them. Meanwhile, American bomber crews continued to drop chaff in larger waves with each mission. With every handful released, the sky behind them filled with drifting metal that twisted in the wind. Pilots flying home at sunrise often saw silver particles still falling far below, catching the light like frost. Those who had flown the deadliest early missions could feel the difference in their bones. The flak burst seemed slower now, less certain, as if the guns were firing at rumor instead of reality. First-time gunners found their nerves easing as inbound fighters arrived late or overshot the formation. The crews didn't celebrate. Not openly. Veterans knew that nothing in this war stayed easy for long. The enemy adapted. The enemy always adapted. But for the first time they felt like they had stolen back a piece of the air. Inside Germany, pressure mounted on radar engineers. The chaff created a problem that their systems weren't designed to solve. German radar had been built with a focus on accuracy. It tracked clear, singular targets. It wasn't prepared to distinguish a bomber from thousands of artificial reflections bouncing back across the antennas. In the tense strategy meetings that followed, ideas clashed sharply. Some insisted the blinding effect was temporary. Others pushed for immediate upgrades. What few expected was how fragile the decision-making had become inside the Luftwaffe's upper ranks. Resources were already strained by engine shortages, fuel scarcity, and political meddling. A few officers believed the Americans had unveiled only a minor nuisance. Others, especially younger engineers, recognized a deeper threat but found themselves arguing against senior staff who dismissed the danger as exaggerated. That internal tug-of-war slowed everything. American intelligence analysts monitoring intercepted communications could see the cracks forming. Reports hinted at confusion at radar stations forced offline, at testing centers struggling to recalibrate their instruments. Each intercepted message confirmed the same thing. Germany didn't know how to respond quickly. The results in the sky were immediate. Missions that once ended in heavy losses now saw more planes returning home. The men felt the difference in their nerves as they unbuckled their harnesses on landing. The tension in their hands loosened. Their shoulders dropped. A few even joked during debriefings, something unheard of months earlier. But even as morale climbed, the officers guiding the air war kept their focus sharp. They knew the success wouldn't last forever. A blinded enemy was still dangerous, and German scientists were too skilled to stay confused for long. So the Americans pushed harder, flying deeper into industrial regions that had been nearly off-limits before. They used chaff to soften the edges of risk, slipping through radar corridors that once meant certain disaster. The crews flying these missions noticed something else too. The Germans were throwing up more flak, but it wasn't well-timed. Whole batteries fired at empty sky. Searchlight crews swept in frantic, looping arcs, chasing false signals. Enemy fighters launched with less coordination, arriving late or at the wrong altitude. The once synchronized machine of German air defense felt out of rhythm. There was danger in that unpredictability, but there was also opportunity. American planners began experimenting with staggered chaff drops, creating layers of interference. Some formations released it early to mask their approach. Others held it until the last minute to break radar lock. A few units experimented with waves of chaff that mimicked entire phantom bomber groups, drawing fighters away from the real targets. It became both a shield and a deception tool. Back in Germany, the mood darkened. The radar teams worked through the nights, analyzing captured foil strips and adjusting their systems in small increments. They discovered the strips matched their radar wavelength perfectly. A precise, almost elegant attack against their technology. Some engineers admired the cleverness quietly, even as they worked to defeat it. But they also argued over solutions. New filtering systems, stronger signal differentiation, alternative wavelengths. Every proposal required time and materials the Luftwaffe no longer had. That internal conflict, scientists pushing for change, officers demanding quick answers, grew worse as American raids increased. Pressure turned into outbursts. Meetings ended in slammed doors. Some engineers warned that solving the problem would take months. Senior officials waved them off, expecting a quick fix. But no fix came. During these weeks, Americans enjoyed a brief, precious window. A rare moment in the air war when their innovation stayed ahead of German adaptation. Crews couldn't see the chaos below, but they sensed it in the smoother flight paths home, in the fewer smoke trails spiraling from damaged bombers, in the quiet moments when every man on board realized they might live another day. Chaff had not ended the war in the air, but it had bent it. It had shifted momentum. It had shown what happened when a simple idea collided with overconfidence. And soon, German scientists trying to fight back would stumble into a mistake that made the situation even worse for them, a miscalculation the Americans would quickly notice and exploit. The clouds over central Germany rolled like dark waves as another American formation crossed the border. The sun sat low behind them, glowing through the haze, turning the bombers into silhouettes drifting across a bruised sky. Inside each aircraft, the crew moved with practiced precision. Bombardiers adjusted sights. Navigators traced the route with pencils worn down to stubs. Gunners scanned the horizon for a glint of wings. And near the radio stations, cardboard bundles lay stacked and ready, each holding the same thin strips of metal that had already rewritten so many missions. The pilots felt the weight of what they carried. Not just bombs or fuel or the hopes of the factories that built them. They carried the edge. The advantage. The kind of tool most wars never gave to both sides at once. Every time they dropped chaff, they knew they were still living inside a rare window where the enemy remained lost. The fear was that it couldn't last. Everyone expected Germany to strike back with something clever of its own. Something that would close this brief gap between survival and disaster. Far below them, that counterattack was already brewing inside a series of German research centers stretched across the country. Engineers bent over equipment, waving their hands through cigarette smoke as they argued over frequency shifts and filtering methods. Officials demanded results, pounding their fists on tables while technicians kept their eyes on schematics filled with crossed-out calculations. What had worked for years no longer worked at all. The problem was that Germany didn't need one fix. It needed many. Radar stations across the map were overwhelmed by false returns, each one showing clouds of signals where there should have been only a tight cluster marking a formation. Filtering out those phantom signals required building new circuits, calibrating new amplifiers, and redesigning the range gates that tracked movement. That type of overhaul needed time, coordination, and materials, things the German war machine couldn't provide easily anymore. Pressure came from every direction. Anti-aircraft commanders complained they couldn't hit what they couldn't see. Fighter squadrons demanded accurate vectors, furious at climbing into the sky only to find the real bomber somewhere else entirely. The radar teams faced criticism from all sides. Some officers accused them of incompetence. Others accused them of pessimism. The atmosphere turned toxic, and the decisions that followed were shaped more by pride than careful thinking. One proposal gained traction in that tense environment. If the Allied chaff worked because it matched the radar frequency perfectly, then shifting that frequency might break its effect. It sounded simple. Switch to a different wavelength and the foil strips would lose their efficiency. In theory, the radar picture would clear. It was a tempting idea, quick, decisive, and appealing to the officers looking for something bold to bring back to their superiors. The engineers warned this wasn't as straightforward as it sounded. Changing the wavelength even slightly required recalibrating antennas, amplifiers, and receivers. It wasn't like adjusting a dial. It meant retooling the entire network. But the momentum behind the idea grew too fast. Officers latched onto it as a solution that could be delivered quickly. It was pushed through before the engineers could finish their objections. The rushed frequency shift created cascading problems. Radar stations began reporting inconsistent results. Some systems became unstable. Others lost range entirely. A few stations accidentally fell out of sync with the larger grid, creating gaps in coverage so wide that American formations slipped through without encountering a single directed fighter attack. In the scramble to defeat chaff, Germany had fractured its own radar net. American intelligence analysts spotted the change almost immediately. They monitored the Luftwaffe's communication patterns and noticed something strange. Fighter groups were being scrambled at odd times, arriving far from the bomber streams they were meant to intercept. Flak batteries that once fired with mathematical precision now fired blind more often than not. Analysts recognized the signs of a radar network being pushed through hasty adjustments. Inside briefing rooms across England, maps filled with updated German defensive zones revealed irregular patterns. Areas that had once been deadly suddenly seemed weaker. Commanders began planning deeper strikes, trusting that chaff combined with the enemy's own mistakes would open corridors into the industrial heartland. The bomber crews flying into those corridors felt the difference. Flak bursts were spaced oddly, sometimes erupting hundreds of feet from where the formation actually was. Searchlights wavered without settling on a single aircraft. The fighters that did arrive came in small, scattered groups instead of coordinated waves. Gunners noticed fewer head-on attacks, the type that required precise direction from ground control. Still, the crews didn't relax. They knew the German engineers would eventually fix their mistakes. They could sense the temporary nature of their advantage every time they looked down and saw smoke columns rising from cities already scarred by war. Nothing about this felt permanent. It felt like breathing room carved from someone else's misstep. In one B-17, the radio operator sorted chaff bundles as the pilot kept the aircraft steady through mild turbulence. The belly of the plane clanged with the sound of the bomb bay doors opening. The bombardier's voice rose over the intercom, calm and practiced. The radio operator reached for the hatch. Over the last month, the act of dropping the foil strips had become routine. But today, as he pushed the first handful into the rushing air, he thought about what it meant. The sky outside shimmered with drifting silver. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. Yet every crew depended on it, trusted it, believed it would keep them alive. Far below, the Luftwaffe's radar teams stared at screens filled with fresh confusion. The frequency shift had changed the picture but not cleaned it. The chaff still produced massive, deceptive reflections. Worse, the altered wavelength made some older equipment nearly useless. The rushed fix had only deepened the problem. Officers were frustrated and morale in radar stations sank. Every attempt to correct the system revealed more flaws. Every adjustment caused another malfunction. The Americans didn't know the full extent of the failure, but they saw enough to push harder. They amplified their deception tactics. Some groups dropped chaff early to create phantom bomber paths stretching across dozens of miles. Others used it to mimic diversionary rates. A few missions deployed so much chaff that ground controllers believed the Allies were mounting their largest assault yet, only to discover later that the real formation had struck a different target entirely. The Germans scrambled fighters again and again, each time missing the real attackers. Their defensive system, once the backbone of their air power, felt like it was slipping out of their control. The crews flying back to England on those days saw something they rarely witnessed during earlier campaigns. They saw more of their own planes beside them. More engines still running. More wings unbroken. More men alive. The sight carried a quiet weight, one they didn't talk about openly. War didn't give many victories that felt personal. But this one did. Still, the window of advantage couldn't stay open forever. The German engineers were testing new filters and pulse sequences, working around the clock to reclaim their radar superiority. They were close to discovering a countermeasure that could threaten the Allies again. But as they inched forward, they missed one more hidden flaw inside their new system. A flaw the Americans would soon exploit on one of the most daring missions of the war. That next turn in the story would decide far more than radar losses or gains. It would shape the future of deception tactics and the outcome of the battles to come. The winter wind sweeping across western Germany carried the smell of burning fuel as another American formation broke through the upper cloud deck. Below them, the country was a patchwork of smoke plumes, rail lines, and dark forests stretching toward the horizon. The bombers held their formation with disciplined focus. Their engines echoed across the sky in a steady rhythm that had become part of the European war's soundtrack. Inside each aircraft, crewmen prepared for what everyone understood would be one of the most dangerous raids of the campaign. The Germans were trying to repair their radar network. Their recent adjustments had caused chaos, but analysts warned that once the final calibrations were complete, the advantage created by chaff could narrow fast. This mission would strike at the heart of their recovery effort. In the lead B-17, the crew moved with a calm sharpened by experience. The pilot checked the horizon for contrails that might signal incoming fighters. The bombardier fixed his gaze on the ground creeping toward them, waiting for the moment to release the payload. Near the radio station, bundles of aluminum strips sat stacked like small bricks of silver. They represented the same invention that had opened this window of opportunity. Today they would be used to exploit the last weakness inside Germany's hurried radar redesign. The flaw had been identified quietly by Allied analysts who studied every intercepted signal. After the Germans shifted frequencies to escape the foil interference, their recalibrated sets produced an unintended blind spot. The new tuning made their radars extremely sensitive to sudden, dense clusters of reflections. If a formation released enough chaff in a concentrated burst at the right moment, the overloaded receivers would freeze or reset, leaving a brief interval where the network simply couldn't track anything at all. It was a small window lasting only minutes, but those minutes were priceless. That was the plan. Overwhelm the enemy system at the exact second the bombers approached the most heavily defended corridor. Timing had to be perfect. Position had to be exact. The crews felt the tension of that responsibility settle over them as they crossed into hostile territory. On the ground, German radar operators watched their screens with strained concentration. Their commanders had pushed them hard to stabilize the new frequency shift, and though the system worked better than it had weeks before, lingering instability haunted every display. Any sudden flood of signals could destabilize the picture. Operators prayed the Americans didn't know that. Above them, the formation pushed forward. Fighters appeared first, small black dots that swelled into menacing shapes as they closed in. Waist gunners swung their guns out instinctively. The first bursts of fire streaked past the fuselages. The escorts dove to intercept, engine noise turning the sky into a vibrating battlefield. The American formation tightened, flying wingtip to wingtip as they approached the corridor where they would release the largest chaff burst of the war so far. Inside the lead bomber, the radio operator listened for the call. Flak blossomed below them, sending up black shocks that rocked the formation. The bombardier counted down the seconds. Everyone braced for the moment the air would change. When the call came, it snapped through the intercom with a sharp authority. Now. The operator pulled open the hatch. Wind roared into the compartment. He threw the first bundle into the slipstream. Then the second. Then the third. Across the formation, dozens of hatches opened at once. Hundreds of bundles of chaff surged into the sky behind the bombers. The scene looked surreal from nearby aircraft, as if the bombers were shedding silver wings. The foil strips spread outward instantly, catching the sunlight as they scattered into a vast shimmering cloud. The density was overwhelming. A blizzard of metal glittered in the air, carried by turbulence into an expanding veil. On the ground, the effect hit like a hammer. Radar screens erupted with violent static. The sudden density of reflections overwhelmed the recalibrated systems. Some displays froze entirely, locking onto a white blur. Others reset in a flashing sequence that took precious seconds to recover. A few units shut down outright, their circuits unable to process what they were receiving. The German air defense network had been temporarily blinded again, but this time in the most critical moment of the raid. American fighters seized the opportunity, driving off the disorganized Luftwaffe interceptors. Flak batteries fired into an empty sky, unaware that the bombers had already crossed into the final stage of their run. The bombardier saw the target appear beneath the bomb sights, clear and unobstructed. With the radar crippled and the fighters scattered, the formation pressed on without hesitation. When the bombs fell, they dropped in perfect lines that tore into the facilities responsible for repairing radar components. It wasn't just a strike against buildings. It was a strike against recovery, against the enemy's attempt to rebuild the shield that had once guarded their cities. As the formation turned for home, more chaff drifted downward, filling the air like metallic snow. The radar network slowly flickered back online, but it was too late. The bombers were already far beyond the danger zone. The crews flew back across the border with the kind of silence that came after a mission where everything worked. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply absorbed the relief. Another day lived. Another mission survived. On the ground, German analysts studied what happened and realized the truth. Their rushed redesign had been turned against them, their system exposed by the very adjustments they hoped would protect it. The Americans had understood their weakness better than they did. And with that strike, the repair effort would take far longer than planned. In the months that followed, chaff became a staple of Allied air power. It shielded thousands of crews, disrupted countless defenses, and set the stage for deeper raids that accelerated the breakdown of German industry. What began as a simple idea in a cluttered lab had grown into one of the war's most quietly influential inventions. And the legacy of the first crewman who defied orders lived through every silver fragment that fell across Europe. His risk had opened the door to one of the most effective countermeasures of the war, a small act of courage that helped turn the air war in favor of the Allies and left a mark on military strategy that would endure long after the last bomber returned home.